Looking to break into or advance your career in cybercrime and cybersecurity? Push your career forward with a master's degree in cybercrime and digital investigation from Michigan State University. Experience a nationally ranked program taught by world-renowned researchers and practitioners that can help you play a role in combating cybercrime and advancing justice for victims. Designed to be completed in as little as 2 years and in a flexible online format that can work around your schedule. Visit cj.msu.edu to learn more.
What up, fam? Welcome to the Crossing the Firewall podcast. My name is Tom Holt. I'm a professor here in the School of Criminal Justice at Michigan State University. I'm also the director for the Center for Cybercrime Investigation and Training. And I am here with my two lovely co-hosts as always. Taylor, take it away.
Hello, everyone. I'm an assistant professor at Michigan State, and I'm also an associate with the Center for Cybercrime Investigation and Training.
And I'm Dr. Rachel McNealey. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Criminal Justice and an associate with the Cyber Center.
So we are going to shift away a little bit from our typical focus on cybercrime today and focus a little more on technology in general. And we have a wonderful guest with us today who I think is going to push us in some interesting directions that we haven't been before. So we have Thomas Dearden with us, who's an associate professor at Virginia Tech University. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit about what you're doing. What's your area of study at the moment?
Yeah, so this has been a series of studies, I would say, and it's been more of a journey than anything I can kind of put into this as my study. But effectively, what I've been looking at for almost 10 years now is the impact of technology implementation, specifically in jails. We've had kind of a lot of focus on prisons and how they are using computers or tablets or all sorts of different technology. In this case, I'm looking specifically at jails and primarily tablets.
So clarify for us the difference between a jail and a prison, too, because I know some in our audience might assume they're the same.
Yeah, so they are, in fact, radically different. The only similarity is they incarcerate people, right? And so, at least for our conversation, your biggest differences are going to be who runs it. So the state or the federal government are going to run your prisons. Subsequently, that leads to things like a lot more funding, because jails are run primarily by counties and usually through the sheriff's office. So they get most of their budget through the county. And right, if you know anything about American funding, that counties tend to be pretty strapped, and so jails tend to be pretty strapped as well.
So for the average.
The other thing I should mention as well, because this usually plays into the conversation, is that usually about 3/4 of people in jail have not been convicted of a crime. So they're individuals who are waiting for the next steps, right? Some type of trial or whatever is going to happen next. There are usually around 25% though who have been convicted of a crime and are serving a short sentence. The general guideline is less than 2 years.
So for the average listener, they may be thinking, why is technology in jail? Why do they have computers? Why do they have tablets? So could you speak to some of the uses that technology has in jail environments?
Yeah, so I think this is going to depend entirely on who you ask in terms of the motivation. So certainly from the kind of inmate or resident perspective, that they are using it as a kind of tool in an environment where there really are no resources. And I keep going back to this, but often they had a very small donation-based library, and so now if they have access to a tablet, they may have access to more books, more education resources, and certainly from, say, like the vendor side, they have easier access to spending money, right, through phone calls or music or videos. And then I'd also say that the jails themselves, usually the officers like them because it's something like most often cited as kind of a pacification tool, right? That this makes the jails themselves quieter.
We have a former graduate student who's now an assistant professor at Arizona State, Kaylin Sanders, who studied basically digital inequality among returning citizens. So people who've been incarcerated for a long time and aren't familiar with the level of technology that's now so ubiquitous. So thinking about jails, is the technology that's integrated there, do you think, a good source for people to learn more? Is it so restricted that it only serves these very specific purposes?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. So I think there's two parts to this. Number one is because they tend to be short stay, we don't have quite the same gap in what's changed in 2 years. I mean, the 2 years old iPhone is rather similar versus a 20-year-old iPhone. And so we don't see quite those gaps, but I have been humbled frequently in doing interviews in jails and kind of talking to the individuals that there often is some general gaps, whether it's technological or educational, that certainly, I wouldn't say can be addressed through the tablet, but are something that show up in the research and some of the things we've done. So, for example, we were looking at how accessible they were in a population, and we found that there were several people who couldn't read, right? And so it made it very difficult to have a text-based interface. And so that's when they started introducing a little bit more graphical elements. So to try to get at some of those accessibility issues for sure.
So how exactly do facilities feel about giving out tablets? I mean, you mentioned that it's sort of a pacifying tool, but beyond that, are there concerns about them being misused for offending while, granted short term, but still while they're incarcerated? Or is it more like the juice is worth the squeeze here to give them a device regardless of what it is?
Yeah, so I can answer this from two perspectives. So we did about 30 interviews from officers and administrators. So about 20 of those were the individuals who were on the pods, right? So they were ones who were with the inmates. And then 10 from various administrators, whoever's kind of running the jail. And we sort of got a mixed bag here. We definitely had individuals who were very concerned that we were rewarding bad behavior, like that we don't give tablets away generally, and so why were we giving them to inmates in particular? Many of these, I guess, critiques from the officers were before they were implemented, and what we tended to see after they were implemented is the officers said, well, I still think that's true, but it's made my job easier. And so that's been, I guess, I'm not sure that's like the ideal motivation for any of this, but we do see kind of a flip in some of their conversations. From an administrative perspective, we're seeing some really interesting kind of data points, and in fact, one of my kind of current projects is looking at things like workman compensation from pre and post tablet implementation. They're kind of saying anecdotally that they're seeing less violence, again, as a pacification tool. And I do use pacification here specifically, as it's not a beautiful word, right? It's not this like totally pro word. It is in fact what I give my kids when I can't deal with them, right? So it's not this entirely idealistic element.
What I've heard from people that have worked in jails, and particularly in the pods, like you mentioned, is that a real key to maintaining the less violent state that they're looking for is by keeping them busy, right? Giving them something to do. But of course, that's restricted. You can't give them certain things to entertain themselves. But because on the outside, our phones are a huge component of keeping our minds busy, right? I know my screen time is much higher than it should be. And so I'm interested in, has this become a way that they are simply reflecting these behaviors on the outside to keep it feel more normalized, to feel like they're not so separated from society?
Oh no, this is where my cynical side is going to come out. And for this, I turn to a lot of the regulatory and marketing area in this space, just because it provides some, I would say, interesting insight onto motivation. So when I first started looking at tablets, I was asked to by one of the vendors because they had just implemented kind of an off-the-shelf type of tablet that was designed for jails, but it wasn't their own, right? And so they were basically kind of renting it to see how it was and putting it in different facilities. And that tablet actually, its kind of marketing pitch was it had a tremendous amount of education hours that were free. And so it was enough that we didn't even know what the education was, and that took about, it was like a year-long project just to go through what was on the tablet and what were they saying was the education. And so this like early marketing pitch really was, we're going to provide something for them to do, and it's going to have value. And we've sort of seen some kind of mix between those two. Certainly the vendors will use the idea that that there's going to be more resources, and realistically for a jail this is rather important. I mentioned that they have very little. Most jails, I'm generally in rural areas, even though I'm in a college town, And so most of the other resources, even the library's donation-based. And I tell this story, and it's a little bit hearsay at this point, but when I was, again, in this first jail I was working with, they had a donation-based library, but no one ever checked out any books. And so we were trying to figure out, like, why, like, you have these bookshelves, and one of the officers took me down and said, look, like, here's the books. And it was all these, like, almost romance novels, and it turned out that the donations were coming almost exclusively from this kind of organization that said, we need to get in jails and help people. And it was really, and I'll say this kind of casually, like elderly white women. And so, it turns out that the things that they were reading was not the things that the people in jail wanted to read. But I will say they were the only ones who were making the donations at the time. So it was like, this is, I have to give them kudos for that.
I mean, it is kind of reminiscent of how people critique people's use of charity as a way to offload stuff they don't want anymore. But specifically, they're borderline smut romance novels, it sounds like.
Yeah, the ones that are, well read. And that's the thing, like many of these organizations that are kind of volunteering time are doing the best they can because no one else is doing it.
So you said it took you about a year to go through the educational content. What were some of those things that were provided to these individuals? Were they focused on digital literacy or financial skills, just building life skills? What would that look like?
Yeah, so this was an interesting build, and this actually was what stirred on the next 10 years for me, roughly, right? So this was 2017, so 9 years. But we found so many things, and it was to the point that it was overwhelming. So there were some really good things on there, but there were some really non-educational things as well, right? The whole pitch, the marketing pitch, was volume rather than quality. And so when I kind of sent this report back to this organization, I basically, a lot of it was, there's a lot of good things that are in here, but they're buried. And there wasn't really great sorting, and so we saw like a lot of the kind of A titles of whatever the courses were being used the most. And some of these were interesting. It was like anger management, right? That was fantastic. Others were car fixing videos, which are great, but probably not where we would lean in from like a criminogenic perspective, right?
So 10 years is a really long time from a technological standpoint. Has there been a shift in the devices, or are they still relatively the same as when you started? Like, tell us a little bit about any technological incremental change, or if it's kind of like the books where it's you get what you get.
Yeah, so there's been a lot of shift, and some of this is technological, but I would say most of this is regulatory. So when we look at jails and vendors, the vendors that come into jails that bring the technology are the ones who are bringing the phones typically, right? And so the phones, you can think of this, they call them RFPs, right? They're much like our grant type of writing elements. They're these huge, massive documents that yield the contract for the next 3 years. And so right prior to tablets being fairly common, it was phone calls, right? We have this many phones. This is how much we're going to charge, and that type of information. So when they brought in the tablets, this became kind of a new avenue for revenue. So they could add in. Now you can have phone calls, right? So now you can have, rather than 2 phones in the jail, you can have basically a 1-to-1 per inmate. And then you can also charge for some of the other resources. And kind of the typical one is the purely entertainment resources. So this would be movies, music, those type of things. And then, of course, we have seen a shift towards video phone calls as well. And again, this is probably the cynical side and academic coming out in me. We've had some regulation around phone calls for a while. I would say it's pretty weak until roughly 2 years ago. And we had very little on any of the other elements, right? So this was kind of like a total freedom. So absolutely, we've seen tablets develop, and they've gotten better. They've gotten more streamlined. They tend to focus on what are the issues at the time. So for us, right, we want faster things, we want newer things. In the jails, we want things that break less when you drop them on concrete. We want things that have maybe headphones or better speakers because you're in this environment where sound travels horrifically and is combating with others. And so they've been a little bit more, I would say, pragmatic oriented, as well as kind of focusing on what would be the next best marketing element. Fortunately, that has led to some increases in the education quality, really.
I'm interested because you mentioned earlier that by providing the tablets, there's some kind of pacification. They're, entertaining themselves. But I'm interested, have they been used as an enforcement mechanism anyway? Like, I'm going to take your tablet away when you misbehave, or, has there been any kind of negative connotation attached to that in any way?
Yes, that's the short answer. And I have very recently I was on a phone call, and they were talking about this as a either kind of like just the deterrent type of elements and all of that element of control, and specifically they were talking about the impact it would have on taking away a tablet from the inmates and how that could be kind of structured as a tool. And I hesitate to say this one, so we can cut it out if you want, but the specific terminology they used was, if you want to see a grown man cry, take away his tablet in jail.
Aww.
I believe that, unfortunately. It makes perfect sense.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Well, and it's interesting, too, because you said it's becoming more common to be used as a tool of communication. So if you take away their visitation ability, that's a whole nother added layer of not only can I not entertain myself, but now I can't communicate with my friends and family on the outside.
Yeah, and this has been a big policy push in both directions. Fortunately, there's plenty of pushback. And the idea is, now that we have video calls, why do we need visitation at all, right? You can just use video calls. And fortunately, at this stage, I would say that the policy has basically been, no, that's a really bad idea. This is a great additional tool, but to replace visitation would have some pretty significant damage.
Well, because my thought is, right, technology is imperfect consistently. And so if you are completely relying on tablets for external socialization for people in your jail, and then the tablets go down, I can't imagine that the county budget is well suited to immediately replace those. And then all of a sudden you have a population of completely isolated inmates. Sounds like a nightmare.
Yeah, no, and this is I've been on the budget side of things, which has been fascinating for me, coming from cybercrime and specifically the kind of financial areas, is to see how this runs financially, because the counties really couldn't afford this. It's coming entirely from the vendors and those RFPs basically saying, we're going to bring in the tablets, which is good in the sense the counties don't have to pay for them. What has been, I would say, some pretty significant hardships has been when those vendors have changed. Say there's a new contract and a new vendor is kind of chosen as the communications person for the jail. That's when they rip all the tablets out and implement a new one. And I'm not sure we've seen this as much in jails, but in prisons we've seen this as a problem because they'll have bot content. So they say they buy a movie on this tablet, and then they switch tablets and they no longer have access to it, right? So it's really, we talk about how slippery some of our digital content is. It's substantially more slippery in our incarcerating environments.
So you're telling me they're not on the cloud yet?
Yeah, well, even if they are, it's a different platform, different company. Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, you mentioned that the vendors are the ones that provide the tablets, so I'm curious, who's responsible for auditing those tablets? Do they go through them? Do they check them? Do they see if any have been jailbroken? Like, who's responsible for the safety and procedures that come with the tablet?
That's a mixed bag, I would say. Certainly, there's a lot of back-end portals that provide data in terms of like the physical elements behind it, whether it's broken, whether it's being charged, whether they've jailbroken, and that tends to be within the jail. Usually, there's someone either from the jail who's doing it, or I would say probably more common that the vendors will have someone who's kind of there as kind of the problem solver for that. Again, an interesting anecdote here that in the early days when we were looking at some of the ways that inmates could use these, and I don't want to say nefariously, but the ways that they weren't supposed to be used, is that they were actually had a bunch of short answer questions on the kind of educational platform, wherever it was, and they would use it to communicate cross pods, right? And so a lot of cross pod communication is not allowed. So instead of filling out the answer as they should for the short answer, they would talk to each other through it. So they'd have share logins or whatever, and kind of communicate that way, which, as an academic, I found more hilarious than problematic, but I'm sure many jail administrators were pretty annoyed with that.
That just sounds like innovation to me.
Yeah.
So when we talk about the cost of tablets and things like that, I know at least in Michigan we use JPay as the method of communication, and so you're talking about 40 cents per email to stamp your email to go out. So how are people getting funds to support either their emails or their phone calls or purchasing a movie? Is that something that has to go through like a canteen or some other kind of setup, or is it truly just system to system?
Well, Tom, I'm really glad you asked about this. This is exciting. This is a regulatory space that has seen some tremendous upheaval in the last, I would say, 3 years. So prior to really kind of Biden era FCC, almost all of this space was unregulated. The phone calls they were fairly expensive, something around 21 to about 80 cents per minute, depending on the jail size. Rather expensive for a phone call. Almost everything else was completely unregulated. So the email cost, the text cost, the video phone call cost, by and large, we didn't have anything in place. Naturally, there was some pushback given that we were implementing tablets like crazy in many of these places, specifically prisons. And so the Biden era FCC implemented some pretty stringent caps, and they knocked it around to, at least for the phones, it was about 6 to 11 cents, depending on the jail size. And they also capped video calls as well, and a few others. Trump FCC, of course, kind of made some changes when they got in. Interestingly enough, they kind of did something halfway in between, and they made it roughly 11 to 19 cents, so more than Biden, but substantially less than before. And so we've seen some of these regulatory things start to stabilize. What I will say, and this is probably another one that is a little unknown, is that as part of these contracts that the vendors get, historically there had been this thing called a site commission, and that is, as part of the contract, the vendor would give back, and I think most people use the word kickback, a certain percentage of the phone call revenue to the jails themselves. And it turned out this was a pretty massive amount. Remember that these jails are strapped for money, so this is actually the Prison Policy Initiative did some kind of digging and found that it was on average about 40% of the revenue was a site commission back to the jail, and as high as 90%. So these were multi-million-dollar site commissions, may or may not be called kickbacks depending on who you ask.
That's a non-trivial amount of money we're talking about.
Absolutely, especially for the counties, right? And many of them kind of survived off of this. And interestingly enough, so the FCC, the kind of Biden era FCC, basically said no more, right? And that came with the caps. And it was really, I would say, going to hamper a lot of counties as well as vendors, which, I mean, to be fair, if you're kind of relying on revenue you're getting from jail phone calls, it's a little dicey to start with. And the interesting thing we are in right now is that the changes that the kind of Trump era FCC implemented, we don't really know if these are back yet. It seems like no, but I'm hearing a lot of there's some kind of language in there that allows for them, and so some places are kind of playing the game again.
So knowing how valuable data is, right? It's kind of the currency that offenders make money off of, but also something that we have to protect very preciously. This setup reminds me of the role of technology in agriculture, and I promise I'm going somewhere with this. But there have been consistent and repeated conflicts between agricultural producers and technological companies, essentially, over who owns that data. Is there a similar conflict in this scenario, or is there thought given to potential data of those inmates being shared, taken, etc.?
Well, that's an interesting one. I don't know that I can answer that at this moment. I have not seen the data being sold like in the same way that we would think of it from our big tech conglomerates. I think that many of at least the vendors that I've seen I'm sure some of the bigger ones may be doing something like this, but many of the smaller ones are very much using this as internal information and using it to help their future RFPs, right? Saying, this is how many hours are being used, this is what they're doing, kind of as part of that pitch to get into new jails. But I'm sure that will come up.
I would imagine so.
Yeah, that makes me think, because I was thinking earlier, when it comes to the vendors, they have to have some motivation to be involved, right? If I'm creating iPads and selling them for $1,000 to the average person in the world, why would I suddenly build this kind of bulk contract with a jail? And so my thought process is, you kind of answered my first part in that the budgets, where that money's going, is mostly back to the vendor, is what it seems, at least in the context of not allowing those kickbacks. So in that context, is it simply they see it as a money-making opportunity, or are these organizations that want to improve digital literacy, or am I just really hoping there's a bigger motivation than just money?
Yeah, that's actually what I started with when I first started kind of working with this organization in particular. I was pretty leery, right? That this is a fairly predatory space, and I think we can say that empirically at this point. And so I was a little concerned of what's the motivation here? So I would say at this point that there is absolutely a financial motivation. Fairly across the board, there are definitely some larger companies who I would say it's pretty well probably exclusively their motivation. What I have been doing though for the last 7 years, and I'm kind of grateful to be able to see it from this perspective and not have to deal with the financial parts at all, is that there is definitely motivation to provide resources in a space that there are none. And so this is where I see the positives, that the education programs I've been working with are really designed for kind of re-entry, especially those re-entry for, say, the people who were there for 2 years. This is the group that I'm worried about the most. Right? If you're there for a day, okay, fine. Right? You don't need anything. Right? You can get back out, whatever. But if you're serving a sentence for 2 years in a jail that's run by a county that is used to just cycling people in and out of this jail, there's often very little, right? This would be a very difficult sentence from a sheer boredom perspective. And so the education's really been kind of a major benefit to them. And fortunately for the last probably 4 or 5 years, that's what I've been looking at is, what are the recidivism elements? What are the best educational programs? I got to do something kind of fun. I got to, we had a whole bunch of educational programs, and we didn't really know, like how were they going to pick them and those type of things. So we actually took the risk assessment strategy from kind of the probation land, right? And they now kind of take this kind of self-assessment, and it directs them and says, hey, these are the programs that we think would help the most. So not only got to develop that, but kind of validate it, and it's pretty interesting working in this space because I know that data is something of a premium for us, but it's not here because there's so many inmates that are using it. We did a survey just to see how they were liking it, and 3 days later I said, how many results do we have? I was thinking like 50. It was 8,500. So it was pretty exciting to be like, wow, I've got this huge data to see what these individuals like about this. And it was just really an opportunity for them to say, this is what I like, this is what I dislike. And many of them obviously liked that opportunity.
What kinds of responses were you getting? I'm just curious because that's probably a very diverse population with real variations in terms of life experiences, technological appreciation, etc.
Yeah, so the survey was fixed response, right? So I don't think I got the quite diversity of responses that I did in interviews, and so we did a bunch of interviews prior to this. The things that surprised me were, from a criminology perspective, I kind of know those elements that relate to recidivism, right? Like, the employment elements and the drug use elements, right? Some of these things that I know are like, this absolutely relates to recidivism. And so I'm like, they're definitely going to be in here. It turns out most of the things they were interested in were, I would say, some of the more kind of metaphysical elements. They talked a lot about the kind of religious programming on the tablet. And so depending on, right, the vendor, this specific one had education, and then the phone call aspect, as well as like hey, if you want to read the Bible or any religious text, or if you want to listen to kind of local kind of religious type of programming. And so they had kind of connected with many of the local churches and basically put the sermons on from that Sunday. And at least in the sites that they had it, I was surprised at how many were like, I'm really glad to be able to stay connected to this church that I was a part of before. It was really kind of interesting there.
So this is a dumb question, but it's one that has to be asked, I think, just given the nature of things. So in 10 years' time, we've had massive transitions in terms of the devices and the accessibility, and now AI is one of those things that's probably past the Rubicon and is something we might expect to find on these kinds of tablets. Can you speculate at all as to how AI might be integrated into a device that could be put into a jail? It seems like there's potential benefits there in terms of therapeutic or religious or other methods, but I guess it is highly dependent on the value and the resources of those entities providing the devices.
Yeah, so I think it first come from a marketing perspective, right? If you're competing with other vendors to have your tablet in there, what is the value that you could convince a jail administrator to adopt? So one of the things that I got to see was kind of how this happens, right? How these RFPs go through, and it usually starts at the jail level, but it doesn't end up there. And so the jail administrator can say, wow, this is great, right? We're providing education to these individuals. We're providing them more access to reentry tools. We're providing them right, just kind of something that they didn't have before in this environment where we have no money. And so the jail administrators were very keen on the education of the reentry. What was interesting is when it got kicked up, they usually say, okay, these are the 3 finalists, right? And they say, we really like this one because it's providing really good education. We really like this one because their site commission's awesome. It was really the bean counter, right? That at the county kind of commissioner level, or whoever was making those decisions, those final decisions, would be like, well, education's nice, but I'm an accountant, right? So the site commission looks way better on this one. And so I do think that there is still a pretty consistent focus on either ROI or what is the value that this is providing.
So I'm intrigued because you mentioned earlier that different vendors are going to have different provisions, right? They're going to have religious components or educational components. So my question is, are they looking into that content in any capacity, or is it just what's available is going to go on the tablet? Because my thought is, at least from the criminological perspective, is that these things aren't being evaluated. There may be other things that we aren't considering in terms of, I think especially within the religious context, religion in jails and prisons is a huge component. And so being able to leverage that may be able to get people to learn and be educated in ways that they weren't open to previously. And so I'm wondering if there's any evaluation component to what the content actually is that's included in these devices.
Well, I don't know how many organizations are doing it, but I'm doing it. So I've got to go through all of the content, and that was actually one of the shifts, is once we kind of went through the early implementation and saw that, wow, there's all this stuff, some of it's good, some of it's not good, we actually looked up to see what was evidence-based and what wasn't, and we had a chart, this is evidence-based, this is not. Interestingly, the organization basically said, this isn't good enough, we could do better. And so we got to start from the ground up and say, what were the evidence-based classes that we could put on here? And so the education, at least for some of these vendors, specifically the one that I'm working for, is been kind of started from an academic perspective, not from a marketing perspective. And so at least we can work on some of the evidence-based stuff. And I will kind of get some qualifiers there that most of the evidence-based programming is from like in classes. So even if we translate that to like this kind of self-directed course, we're now to the point that we did that, but we want to measure and see what's been the impact. And so probably for the last couple of years, that's been primarily what I'm doing, is different site kind of analysis on either the content or kind of the general effects on the populations in those specific counties.
Now, I'm not a correctional scholar, so I can only speak to my casual understanding of this, but there's not really that much research on the use of tablets and devices and things like that in correctional settings, whether it's jails or prisons, right? Or am I mistaken?
There's more now. I would say academics are a smidge slow, and I think that's probably also an empirical element there. So it does take us a while to get out. I think that a lot of the, especially critical commentary, is coming from many of the kind of non-university think tank type of or policy organizations, and so we do see a lot from them. And this data is exclusive, right? This is owned by the vendors. They're not necessarily interested in having academics come in, most of them, and say like, "Wow, this is terrible." We are. I don't want to say pessimist, but right, we do tend to look through a rather critical lens on just about everything, and marketers don't love that.
I can understand that. Do you find it difficult? I know obviously you come from one vendor's perspective, but is there any outside pressure to include certain things or to not include certain things? Because I just keep thinking in the back of my head, there's a person in my family that I know would say, why do they need a tablet? They're in jail, it should suck. Right? So how do you kind of play that political line? And again, I know you're coming from one vendor's perspective, but there's got to be some influence there of why are we giving them this in the first place?
Yeah, and I've seen this, and what I will say is I'm very fortunate to be in my bubble and basically have entire freedom to look at empirical measures. I get to go in and talk to the inmates. I don't talk to victims, right? This is not something that I do, so I have a lot more compassion towards the inmates and supporting kind of their needs and kind of measuring from an empirical sense, like if what they're saying is accurate. So I feel very fortunate to not necessarily face that. I really have the opportunity to look at this from a purely empirical lens, even from a consulting side, right? Many consultants would be in a space where they say, you're consulting, but you're consulting to say positive things. And I've been repeatedly told, and I've done some analysis and said, guys, this is not working. And they said, great, we'll fix it. Now let's remeasure. And so I feel very fortunate to be in that kind of area. Otherwise, I'd have some definite more moral fights with myself if I had to do something different.
I'm just struck by, and this is absolutely no surprise to anyone who's familiar with corrections, but it always gets me, is the lack of standardization across incarceration as a response to crime in this country. And it's because it's nearly impossible to standardize across the board, right? The way that the system's set up, like you explained, jails are funded by these very localized organizations. But my God, how do we know anything about the functions of jails as crime response when even down to the content offered on tablets is different depending on who you signed a contract with?
Oh yeah,
I'm
and just
baffled.
just to throw a single fun stat out there, we don't actually know how many jails are in the United States. Right? We think that there's roughly one per county, but that's not true because smaller counties have contracts with each other and then overflow contracts, and it's we kind of have an idea. It's like 2,100-ish, but beyond that, we don't have a specific number as far as I've been able to find.
Is it reasonable to assume then that at some point in the near future there might be since obviously some correctional facilities are privately owned, that there will be the privately owned tablet that farms the data from those prisoners specifically for their own purposes?
Oh, absolutely. If it's not happening now, yeah, for sure it would happen in the future.
Mm-hmm.
I just keep thinking the marketing perspective on anything related to corrections just makes me kind of antsy. Or like, why are we worrying about how to make money off of something? And so I'm really intrigued in how you've been able to kind of wedge your way in this world that is so driven by money and being able to say, no, this didn't work, and getting positive feedback for saying that. Because, when you said that about jails, it blew my mind. It makes me realize I don't know much about corrections, but I can't imagine an environment where an academic gets invited in such an intriguing and important risk-related environment.
Yeah, and that's actually why I've been careful to talk about this stuff or publish off of it generally. I do feel very privileged to be able to kind of be in a non-academic space, and using my hopefully academic brain to help some decision making. It is interesting to see that some of our widespread thinking just kind of falls apart when at the local level, and I know like that many of the phone call systems, especially historically, have been very predatory, but I also understand that the counties have kind of relied on this money, right? That usually, like in my local county, around 70% of the county's budget goes to school, and the schools are underfunded, right? And all of a sudden you've got 30% for literally every other service. Absolutely, your jails are going to be underfunded in just about every circumstance, especially in your rural areas. I got to go to one jail that was a converted high school. They said, well, we need a new high school, we need a new jail. Let's just take the old high school, put some bars on it, and we've got ourselves a jail. So it was like going back to high school. It felt really traumatic. I actually liked being in jails. I did not like being in that high school where they had beds in former classrooms.
I was recently in a high school, though, that did strike me as this could very easily be a correctional facility because there were bars everywhere, and it was just sort of odd where that railing, everything here just strikes me as correctional rather than educational. So, it's a very weird thing you just described.
Yeah, it was very weird to be there as well, to go to the kitchen and, it was the same kitchen you went through in high school, and you're like, oh no, this is like my nightmare.
When they rebuilt our high school in our hometown, we found out that the architect was both a prison architect and a education place, and so we had the same conversation of why does the new high school kind of look like a jail?
I mean, it reminds me of the school to prison pipeline, but quite literally in their actual construction.
There were people there who were like, I was here in high school, and you're like, oh, that sucks.
That would be terrible. That would be your worst nightmare envisioned, being locked in geometry class.
Yeah.
Right, most people have nightmares about it, and for these people, it's a nightmare come very true.
Do they still use the lockers, though?
I didn't see them. I wonder if they ripped them out. I didn't
maybe.
obviously see the entire jail, but usually for me it was in the hallways. I didn't see them in the hallways, so.
Cool. So at the end of our episodes, we tend to ask this kind of wrap-up question of if you could take everything we've talked about and distill it down to one takeaway for our listeners. What do you think is the most important thing for them to learn from our conversation today?
Yeah, I think that jails need more resources, and we really need to rethink incarceration and reentry. And we're doing probably the best we can with the resources we have, but it's absolutely not good enough.
Well, this was fascinating. This is one of those issues that I know so little about. It was really helpful to get a little bit better handle on it. So thank you for talking to us. This is really helpful. Yeah,
for sure. And I'm hoping your viewership is not that high, so this doesn't get kicked back to some of the people I work with, and they're like, well, it's kind of dicey.
I think your risk is pretty low.
Well, smash that like and subscribe button, listeners.
Yeah, I'm sure they'd be fine with it. They're the ones who actually told me about many of these things. We're really suffering because we can't pay the site commissions that other. And I'm like, what's a site commission? And they're like, oh, it's a kickback. I'm like, what do you mean, right? And so this was an interesting learning process from them. Right? This is fairly normal to them, but for me, I was like, what are you talking about?
I had no idea. So this was very helpful.
Yeah. It's they don't want you to know, right? I mean, and specifically since we're off the record now, right? It's really the big vendors.
We're on.
Oh.
JJ cut it.
Yeah, we can cut this part. Yeah. No, there's absolutely some predatory vendors, I will say. Absolutely.
I think
100%.
Anything in this environment of there's a niche need and I have something that I can adapt to meet it, there's going to be predatory themes.
Yeah, I agree.
Especially in jails.
Yeah.
But all of the services are vendor oriented, right? So your medical, your food is usually Aramark, just like universities, right? So it's not just the phones, right? The phones are often easiest to talk about, but almost every service is a vendor, whether it's a private or public jail. We'll go with that term.
works.
Well, we appreciate you being on, and thank you for all of the clarity that you can bring to this relatively hidden topic.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. And thanks everybody for joining us, and we look forward to having you with us the next time we cross the firewall. Thanks for listening to the Crossing the Firewall podcast. This is a production of the Center for Cybercrime Investigation and Training in the School of Criminal Justice at Michigan State University, produced by J.J. Thomas. The thoughts and opinions expressed are those of the hosts and the guests and do not necessarily reflect those of the university. If you have a comment or a question about the show, please email us at crossingthefirewall@gmail.com. Also, make sure that you follow us on Instagram and LinkedIn for more information. And if you're enjoying us on your favorite podcast app, please make sure that you like the show and leave us a review so that way everybody knows what we're up to. And if you're listening in on YouTube, make sure that you like us and subscribe so that way you're staying up to date on everything that is crossing the firewall.